Madam Chair, I think you need to turn your microphone on.
Thank you very much. All right, let's start this over. Good morning. I'm going to call our Monday, February 10th meeting to order. This is the Policy and Innovation Committee for SACOG. And I'd like to start with the Pledge of Allegiance. So will you please stand and join me in the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Madam Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Thank you. Good morning. Just before I call roll, just wanted to let you know as a reminder how to use our microphones. You don't need to pick it up and hold it up to your near you, but if you do need to press the button, and when it lights green, you are being amplified in the room and being broadcasted through our Zoom meeting. Director Andreatta?
Here.
Chapdelaine?
Here.
Vialdo absent, Kennedy absent, McCully?
Here.
Rodriguez?
Here.
Schaefer?
Here.
Soon?
Here.
Veerkamp?
Here.
Vice Chair Vega absent, and Chair Dowden Calvillo.
Present.
Thank you.
Let the record show that for the purposes of our meeting today, we do have a quorum. Next item on the agenda is public comment. This is an opportunity for any member of the public to address the committee on an item not on the agenda today. We can't take action on said items, but we can refer them to staff for subsequent review and potentially coming back. With that, I'd like to open up public comment. Is there any public comment?
There's no public communications or comment.
All right, well, I'm going to close public comment and move to consent. We have only one item on consent. It's the approval of the December 2nd committee meeting minutes. Any questions or concerns? Do I have a motion?
Move approval.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any public comment?
There's no public comment.
No public comment. I'll go ahead and those in favor of the motion to adopt the minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Let the record show the motion has been adopted. Moving on to action items. The first item is Policy Innovation Committee charge. Eric, you're going to give us an update on what our charge is and our responsibilities. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. So the item before you in writing shows you that the charge of the Policy and Innovation Committee, and staff is not recommending any changes. I did want to take a few minutes this morning because I know we have some new members on the committee to give you a bit of an overview of what this committee focuses on, and happy to answer any questions about the charge of the committee as I go through this. So just want to hit on a few things, just the overall broad areas of where the committee focuses, and then I'm going to go into a little bit more depth on our overall work program and budget, as well as the transit-related funds that SACOG administers. So this committee is one of 3 committees of the board, as you know, and in this committee, we really focus on state and federal advocacy, our budget and overall work program, which I'll talk about in a moment. This is the Audit and Financial Policies Committee, so anything related to both the audit of the SACOG budget as well as the funds that SACOG oversees comes through this committee. This is also a committee where any fraud or other issues are reported. This committee has an important role as well in kind of overseeing SACOG's work to engage with elected officials. We know that you all are appointed by your cities and counties, but from time to time, especially when we're working on things like the blueprint, we want to ensure that all local city and county elected officials understand what SACOG is working on and do outreach. And so we'll sometimes bring items to this committee for that. We also have started some new innovative programs in the past, and as those are starting up, this is a committee where we've gotten some feedback and direction on whether to pursue those and what those shape up like. SACOG has a staff of about 60, and so this committee, if there's any changes to the personnel rules or our employment agreement with our employees association, those items come here. We're currently in an employee agreement MOU that goes through the middle of 2027. So it's a ways off from anything coming before the committee in that area. And then finally, the last area I'll talk about in the presentation this morning is the transit related funds that are really administrative in nature that come to this committee. So a little bit of context for our newer members. So SACOG adopts an overall work program and budget, and the overall work program is a federally and state required document that goes into much more detail than your typical municipal or county budget about the types of planning activities both that SACOG is doing as well as those that are funded with state and federal funds in the 6-county region. And so this includes many pass-through funds that SACOG passes on to cities, counties, transit agencies that are not actually spent by SACOG. And so, for example, I'll show you in a minute kind of what the overall size of the budget looks like. And it is adopted concurrently with the budget, but is a separate document from the budget because there's things like our board and advocacy budget, which is funded through dues from member agencies that are not included in that overall work program. We also adopt a separate budget because SACOG sits as the board for the Capital Valley's Regional Service Authority for Freeways and Expressways, as well as with some members from San Joaquin County. So this month, our staff is preparing a draft overall work program to submit to Caltrans. This is part of their process where we submit it for comments for technical compliance because there's planning requirements that we're supposed to demonstrate that we're working towards. So that is done by the end of this month. This committee will actually be hearing the draft budget at its meeting next month. So that's why I wanted to give you a little bit of information today about kind of what the scope of our budget is. And then we'll be coming back in April after we get any public comments, as well as comments from our state and federal funders on the budget to recommend adoption of the final budget for the fiscal year, which starts in July this April. It's required by Caltrans that we submit it by May 15th. And since our board typically meets after May 15th, we have to adopt the final budget in April. I know there's a lot that happens, right, throughout the year. And so typically what we do is we will amend the budget a few times a year, and we'll bring those all back to this committee for amendments. But that's our normal schedules, bringing a draft budget in March and a final in April. So to give you a bit of a picture of kind of what SACOG's budget looks like, first show you the revenues here. So SACOG receives a variety of different fund sources, and Christina Svensk and I are actually going to speak a little bit more later this morning about transportation funding in general. But in terms of what goes into our budget and overall work program, about 1/3 of the funding is coming from the federal government. Our state share is currently about 46%. A lot of that are one-time funds related to the Green Means Go activities. The state put a large infusion of funding to us to grant out to cities and counties. And so that increased the size of our budget on a short-term basis. And then the last piece are local funds, primarily related to the state sales tax on that funds transportation purposes. On the right-hand side here, you'll see some of our expenditure categories. And so as I mentioned, pass-through costs represent a sizable portion of our budget. There are those grants that SACOG is either making on a discretionary basis or funds that flow through SACOG on a contractual basis. And then the rest is primarily made up of staff costs, consultant costs, and other miscellaneous expenditures. So happy to take any questions on the budget and overall work program before I move on to talking about transit-related funds for a minute.
Thank you, Eric. Are there any questions for staff at this time? Yes.
Eric, is there a breakdown? You mentioned some of this cost.
Excuse me.
Director Sim. Thank you. Sorry, thank you. Eric, do
Yes.
you, some of the staff costs, do you break it out as to whether they're supporting state and federal programs or, you know what I mean, like planning versus things that, you have to do internally? Is there a breakdown of that?
There is, and we're happy to bring back specific information to kind of roll some of that up. When you see the draft overall work program, and if you looked at what we have adopted currently, there are a few dozen work elements is how our work is divided up. And each of those work elements talks about how much staff time is there and what work it's funding, as well as the funding sources applied to that. And so of these many funding sources on the left, and this is really simplified, there's probably 24 different funding sources that we're rolling up to this simplified chart. those are then spread out across all the required activities that SACOG has, as well as some of the discretionary board-directed activities. So yes, there is kind of a one-for-one, these staff are working on these activities with these funds.
So if I understand you correctly, we get a grant from state or federal funding,
Right.
there's obviously, work that you have to do that is commensurate with those monies received.
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Okay.
And when you see our budget, it's kind of broken into three major pieces. So there's our core activities, there's our grant funded activities, and then kind of services to others. And so as a management team, when we're looking at things, right, if we're going to go apply for a grant, we look at what staff do we have available? Is this something that is going to be funded by this grant, or do we have other funds that we want to pair to kind of leverage this grant? Is it in service of what's in our overall strategic plan? And then we'll bring forward a recommendation to apply for that grant. And then those staff for a temporary period basically charge their time to that grant. And we kind of review that on a rolling basis.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay.
Thank you. Are there other questions? All right. Well, thank you very
Okay.
much, Eric, for the overview. I appreciate that, especially for our new members. This is an action item, so is there a motion? Actually, I'll ask for public comment first. Madam Clerk, is there any public comment on this item?
There's no public comment.
And
Yes, Eric.
Madam Chair, I just had one last slide here I wanted to
Oh.
just reference before we take an action.
Of course, sorry.
That's okay. So next month, you'll be hearing an item on our allocations of transit funds. And so, as I mentioned, these are funds that come to SACOG through the state, and they're primarily passed through to transit agencies, cities and counties on a formula basis. And so it's a significant amount of money, but there's not a lot of discretion really that's utilized by SACOG and how these are done. We have an oversight responsibility, and so we do annual financial audits to ensure that the recipients or the claimants of these funds are using them for the intended purposes under state law. And then we also go through a triennial audit that SACOG pays for some administrative funds that we take off the top to ensure that overall we're complying with the TDA requirements in the law. So we'll walk through that a little bit more next month when those items come forward for action. But that again is something you'll see here and at the board level, these claims for transit funds or TDA funds that come through SACOG. And I just wanted to give you some context for what those are. Okay, and that's
Thank
all I
you.
had.
And thank you very much. Appreciate. It's nice to have our charge written out and very clear, so there's no guessing on that. So I do appreciate that very much, and that we've done that for some time. So there are no changes to the procedures and the policy as it was adopted last year, but we'll go ahead and I'll accept a motion to adopt.
Madam Chair, also move.
All right, there's a motion. Is there a second? Motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none. Well, shall we do a voice vote, Madam Clerk, or is a roll call vote sufficient?
Roll call vote is not needed. We can just take
Okay,
a vote in the
those in
room.
favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The record show the motion has been adopted. All right, next item is for information purposes, the next three items. We have an advocacy update.
Right. Good morning. Sure that I can hear me. Renee DeVere Oki of your staff. Since this is our first committee meeting, and some of you are new, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on our team here, just so you know how to work with us. So we have a group we're called our Government Affairs. So we have Christina Lockie, who is our director. She's actually back in DC right now, meeting with Matsui and at a conference. I know some of you had thought about attending, but maybe next time. We have Bless that works on our state affairs. I work on federal affairs, and we also have Gabby who helps coordinate kind of across teams as well as any grants that you may be interested in, like letters of support. The way we format our kind of these updates for you is that you have a state as well as a federal update, and that's kind of looking back at the month prior. And then we use their update that's happening here to kind of catch you up on any live activities that are going. So it depends on what's happening during session, the details on that. I wanted to call your attention to attachment A. That is how we approach looking at different policy activities and principles that are going forward, kind of how we look at what we need to track and then how we respond. Big policy issues obviously come back through here and on that timely matter for taking actions on when we need to approach. And then as you'll be hearing kind of throughout the rest of the year, as noted in our item, our big advocacy updates or what we're tracking this year is continuing to look for Green Means Go funding. And then on the federal side, we have our transportation reauthorization that we'll be tracking over this next year into 2026 when that expires. So you'll hear a little bit more about that. We do have state as well as federal lobbyists. And so today I'll be kicking it over to our federal side, Jason Pavlicek, who will give you the update about what's happening right now. We probably don't need the state slides quite yet. Let's see if Jason, are you there?
I am here. Can you guys hear me okay?
We hear you and we see you. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well on this Monday morning. As Renee mentioned, Christina is actually meeting with Representative Matsu's office as we speak with Devin Barnhart, my partner, who obviously could not be here because that is where she is as well. Just want to give sort of a little update in terms of where things are related to federal funding. There's been a lot of action, a lot of, I think the word I'll use is confusion in terms of what it means. And I'm going to hopefully break a lot of it down for you and at least clear up some of the confusion. And then we'll talk a little bit about the upcoming transportation reauthorization bill. We have a written report we'll send for everyone, but every time we put something on a slide, something changed. So I was afraid to make slides last week and then have everything change. Sort of to give a little bit of a play-by-play, when President Trump was initially inaugurated, he passed a number of executive orders, one in which stated that he was putting a funding freeze, in particular on anything related to the Green New Deal and or diversity funding, effectively, at least for a couple of hours, shutting down the Department of Transportation's financial accounting system. That has since been lifted. There were probably 2 or 3 orders between when he first became president and now, where in different ways said he was going to freeze not just transportation money, but all federal funding. The courts have struck that down, at least temporarily. What that means for transportation right now is at the very least, a vast majority of federal dollars that are available through formulas remain available. We have, at this point, no reason to believe that formula dollars will be frozen again, and that formula dollars will continue to flow. At the same time, though, the Trump administration continues to seek the ability and is continuing to pursue review of competitive grants in screening them for anything that they believe violates their administration's priorities related to ending what they DEI practices, ending climate change focused projects and programs that, in their words, would have detrimental impacts to those who drive or to the general economic system. That is a very political way of trying to sort of describe where things are. Again, I think for the most part, formula funding is fine, and a vast majority of the money that we receive, SACOG receives, comes through the formulas. We are actively engaged and aware of other communities that have seen some of their reconnecting communities and other programs see that money initially frozen. To date, we have not seen any competitive grants that SACOG or any of our partners have received frozen. That is not to suggest it won't happen, and it's also not to suggest that it will happen. This is a very, very fluid situation, In many ways, it is unprecedented, at least in the last 50 years. But it really sort of, I think, sets the table and sets where things are and where they're going to be and where they're going to be going in terms of a federal transportation reauthorization, where the administration stands. So just to be very clear, right now, at least, federal transportation funding remains intact. We have no reason to believe that over the next 2 years, we will not continue to see formula dollars flow as we expect. We do think there will be scrutiny on some of the grants that have already been awarded. Their legal ability to cancel or freeze that funding is certainly being questioned in the courts. Initial court rulings are that they cannot unaward or defund anything that has already been awarded or anything authorized by Congress. Moving forward, we expect to see a very different priority for grants moving forward. So a lot of the programs, whether it's the BUILD program, formerly known as RAISE, formerly known as Tiger, or any of the competitive grant programs that still exist under IIJA, and remember, there are 2 years left of funding for many of those programs, we expect to see a different set of priorities. In the last administration, Justice 40, which was a policy that says 40% of all federal transportation dollars should go to disadvantaged communities, that is gone. The new Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, has put forth a new memo, a new policy that focuses in particular on areas of high birth and high marriage rates. It's the same context, same sort of demographic screen that the Trump or the Biden administration put on, but just a different type of demographic and a different focus area. We have begun to do some analysis in terms of what that could possibly mean for the region in terms of how do your birth and marriage rates compare to other regions. It's nothing at this point. We have no reason to think that our region would be negatively impacted by that metric. But we'll have more details and we'll pass that along to staff. But again, this sort of sets the table in terms of moving forward reauthorization. Myself and Devin are working with your team to think about reauthorization and what that means for the greater region. The process of reauthorization has already begun. There have been 2 hearings. The third will be this Thursday related to safety. And we think that this is going to be, at least initially, a bipartisan effort to reauthorize the transportation bill, which is very, very important. The fact that Democrats will be in the room, the fact that they'll not just be in the room, but have a sort of a somewhat equal footing in terms of policy is very, very important, especially given, I think, where the Trump administration presently is, which is focus on road building, just to be very blunt. And not to say that road building is bad, but they're solely focused on road building. That process began with a handful of hearings and will continue throughout the summer. One thing I will note, I found very interesting that over the weekend, Secretary Duffy spoke to AASHTO, the Organization for State DOTs, and he referenced in his comments that they expect the House to have a bill out of the House by the end of this calendar year. Just to put things in perspective, the transportation bill is not due to expire until the summer of 2026. But just to keep something in mind, the current chairman of the House T&I committee is a Republican who's term limited for his chairmanship. So the best chance to get a bill done in this Congress is early action. So that's a very long way of saying that we are engaged, and I'm glad we are, because this bill, at least initially, is going to attempted to be out the door and ready for prime time, I think sooner than many experts had indicated. Whether that will ever be successful in this Congress is to be determined. Right now, Congress is in the process of going through what is known as budget reconciliation. It's a process by which the ruling party effectively can pass any monetary issues without a threat of a filibuster. But what we're seeing in the House is that with a 2-seat majority, getting 220 Republicans to agree on anything is quite the challenge. So, relating back to that reauthorization, if at any point the bill does not become bipartisan, it will be very, very tough for Republicans to pass a transportation bill without the help of Democrats, especially in the Senate where it would be subject to a 60 vote threshold. We have begun to discuss our priorities and internally and also engaging with our stakeholder groups, AMPO, the National Association of Regional Councils, and some of the other partners. And we look forward, I think, to aggressively going after a continuation of things that will help the Sacramento area, including Green Means Go, and other priorities. Let me stop there. I think, Renee, you wanted to have a little bit of time if there were any questions.
Yeah, does anybody have any questions for Jason?
Thank you very much for that presentation so far. And I appreciate the information, the insight with regards to the Trump administration and the grant priorities in particular. So thank you very much for that information. Colleagues, are there any questions for staff at this time? Yes,
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Chair.
A quick question. So we heard the federal government's focusing solely on roads, which helps a lot of us here. But how does that reconcile with, we know the state is still focused on transit and, literally they're looking at capacity building projects as a bad thing. So what do we do?
The good news, I think, for lack of better words, is that, in terms of funding, 90% of it goes through a formula, right? So the eligibilities for a lot of the programs, a lot of the funding that we get will be unaltered. There will not be drastic changes to them. Even in reauthorization, you will continue to get CMAQ, you'll continue to get Surface Transportation Block Grant money where the eligibility is very, very flexible. With competitive grants, there are still the overarching legal requirements. So, for example, within transit world, there's the bus facility grant program. This administration is not going to be able to take that money and say, hey, let's build another lane on I-5 with that money. You still have to sort of fit within the legal sort of guardrails that exist. I think what we'll see where the influence will be is if you look in a lot of the competitive grant programs over the last 4 years, very rarely do you see, a street widening, a road widening. You see a lot of emphasis on active transportation being winners, et cetera, et cetera. That is not to say that those types of projects will not be allowed and will not be accepted. But I think you'll begin to see more of traditional, what is generally described as traditional infrastructure, winning a lot of these competitive grant programs. And I think that is, I don't think that's necessarily in contrast to a lot of what the state is doing. I think there's a lot of projects that California has won where if the story is told a different way, for lack of better words, it is a project that will win in this new administration, right? So a lot of this is just what aspects of a project do you highlight? There's only so many different things you can do with federal transportation money. So I do not see a situation where transit, active transportation, those things are completely ignored in this administration, but I don't think it'll be a focus. And again, I think a lot of the things that we've done and a lot of the things that member jurisdictions in this region, but also statewide have done, the attributes that have been highlighted for the Biden administration perhaps will be muted a little bit, but some of the other attributes of the projects that this administration would be highlighted. So I think it's more about how the story is told rather than, California just will never get another dollar ever again. So I think hopefully that answers your question, but I think that's
Director
how it
Sandin?
was.
Or if you have a follow-up.
Yeah, just to clarify, so it sounds like what I'm hearing is we still go after, first of all, I heard you say federal monies are very limited in terms of what it's formulaic, but the aspects of the grants that we do go after, even if they're solely road focused, just because we have maybe a conflicting state requirements, it won't hurt us in competing for those road projects. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay.
At least initially.
Yeah.
Again, this is, and again, I get kind of tired of saying this. I've been at this for 25 years. I've never seen what's transpired in the last 3 weeks. I've never seen in 25 years of doing this, and that is not affirmative or negative commentary. It's just it is full steam ahead in a lot of ways. And they will clean up the legal mess later. So, I know what the law says and what they're intending to do. My hope is they will continue to sort of stay within the guardrails. But again, I think with the projects, there's nothing that we've put forward or nothing that I've seen others in our region put forward where it couldn't be painted in a different light, in a light that would appeal to this administration.
Great, thank you.
Director Zuna, I'm just going to say, we're going to have actually a presentation on transportation funding in the region, federal, state competitive formula. So it's actually a great tee up for a presentation we're going to do for you. So you can see how much is competitive, how much comes by formula, what happens at federal, what happens at state. And I would just remind you, yes, we are under California greenhouse gas reduction law. Our long range plan has everything in it, right? I mean, from transit to road repair and maintenance and filling potholes to expansion. So, I think there's a way, as Jason was just saying, to know your audience and figure out how to be strategic and thoughtful, right? So that's one. And then I just wanted to add on, especially for the new members, number one, I know we've said this a lot, please, if you can come back to cap to cap, come back to cap to cap. And if you can't do that, or even if you can, get to really know your congressional delegation, your offices, even in the district. And there's just to put a finer point on what Jason said, if you're coming to cap, you'll hear a lot more about this. Every 5 or 6 years, it's no longer really regular, right, Jason? Nothing is regular anymore, but every 5 or 6 years, there's an authorization bill for transportation. That's the thing that Jason said next summer it expires, and that maybe the House might actually try to get something done this year. That's a big deal. So we want to be really engaged in that. That sets the rules, kind of like the farm bill, right? The transportation bill. Then every year, there's the annual budget, right? So how much money is going into all these different buckets from the authorization, but in the appropriation level. And that's also really important to play at. And then this ebbs and flows, but we still have, what do we call it now? Community directed spending, what used to be called earmarks, right? So many of you are working with your members to say, hey, can we get $1 million for this, $1 million for that? That also comes through the appropriations process. Point being, no better time than to go back to DC, go to cap, and also no better time, frankly, what Jason just said. This is really a divided Congress. We are a bipartisan region. We need to double down on that and work across the aisle, across the region. You've never been more important as a region, really, with our bipartisan delegation as we are now. So,
and if I could add to that, James, Rep. Kiley represents or sits on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. That is the committee that handles federal transportation policy. To James's point, they control, effectively what will be either the next 4, 5, 6 years of federal transportation funding. That's the beautiful part of federal transportation funding. A vast majority of it gets decided in this reauthorization process. That's where we begin to tweak policies, create programs, determine what the national focus is. Rep. Kiley, who's been very, very engaged with us, and I think wants to hear from you. He will have a voice on that. And then both of our senators, Senator Padilla and Senator Schiff, sit on the Senate Environment Public Works Committee, which handles all of the highway programs. In the Senate, the highway and transit programs are divided between and the Environment Public Works Committee and the Banking Committee, but all of the formula programs that we get, CMAQ, STP, carbon reduction, our planning funding, all of that is controlled by the Environment Public Works Committee. And somehow both of our senators are on that committee. And that's a great thing. I think it's the only committee that has 2 senators from the same state. So to have 2 California senators, and again, they want to do a bill bipartisan as well. So that's incredibly important. And just to underline what James said, I can't tell you how important it is for these members of Congress to hear your voice and hear how important local control over federal transportation dollars is. The good news is California has a state law that mandates the money comes to you or comes to SACOG via formula. It's incredibly important that your delegation understands and knows that. And we're certainly communicating that, but hearing it from their mayors, their county council members, et cetera, is really, really important. And Devin and I are working with the Cap to Cap team to in any way we can to help with that event, make it the best possible.
And I think it's like you said, really, it's just a matter of maybe adjusting our message, especially for the competitive grants, for the formula grants, that it is what it is. But, you know, for us as a region to really kind of tailor that discussion to, again, the whole green means go, green dollars, and the connection between transportation and economic development and how important that is. So when we are meeting with our delegates, we're focusing on that, you know, and we all do need street repair and potholes repaired and things of that nature. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? But again, just really focus in our message and, you know, reconfiguring some of our proposals from the past administration to the new. And that's not unusual. I mean, obviously this administration has taken some very bold moves early on, but you know, a change in policy and direction is not necessarily, you know, it's not a new thing. It happens. So, and just we'll continue to adapt as we always have here at SACOG. And I have no doubt that we're going to continue to succeed as we have, but we just need to kind of reconfigure our messaging again, really focusing on that economic development, the job creation, those kinds of things versus maybe looking at climate and things of that nature. So we'll deal with that on the state side because we still have to achieve all those things at the state side. So we're going to have this set of messaging for the Fed and this set of messaging for the states. A little bit more work, but we'll make it happen. So thank you.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I'm just curious with the Olympics coming down to LA later. It's my understanding that they are already looking to fix their roads and get their infrastructure in. So I guess it's more of a comment. I guess we're really going to have those competitive grants, we're really going to have to show the need. But I'm not sure if federal dollars, do you know if maybe, it is California, so I don't know where the administration right now is sitting, if there's going to be special funding or funding taken out of the transportation budget or whatever to go to help LA,
I think they budget, they've known that the Olympics are going to go down south. So I think that they have been budgeting for that. To me, and it's not so much on the transportation side, it might be for other things, but I think the fires in Southern California are, that's like,
Right.
that was not planned for at all. So there's some infrastructure and some roadways and things like that, so my
But
thoughts.
Richard Rodriguez, I think it's a really good question. And I'll see if Jason has anything to weigh in on, because already we know that LA is in the state capital. So at the state level, the Olympics are definitely being talked about as a reason that, more funding should shift south. And so as I think it's also a good segue into Chris Lee and our state advocacy, that's nothing new. Southern California has always wanted, and the Olympics now give some rationale. And it really, I think, suggests why we need to make sure that we are united in this region, in the state capital, right? We've got a strong voice. We have other important things, and our economy is growing, our population is growing. So yes, already is that push at a state level in particular, but all the more reason that we need to be vocal and need to be active with our delegation in the state capital.
So James, I think you sort of teed me up just to real quickly. None of the federal funding, the formula funding will be readjusted, right? Like there's no way that the state can say, hey, we're going to take some of your surface transportation block grant money and we're going to shift it down to LA. So I think practically speaking, any money that goes to LA Olympics and as far as transportation will have to be money that is added on. I know in the last appropriations bill, there was 200 million set aside for planning. What I know about the status of the Olympic game preparations, and I'll also throw in the World Cup into that, is that they were requesting 200 billion for planning and then expecting about a $1.2 billion need. Now, what I will say, and I will say this carefully, is that if you are building out major transit systems, if you're still looking for money 3 years before you want it delivered, you should stop thinking. I will just simply say I helped get the first dollar for the Silver Line here in Washington, D.C. to build rail to Dulles, and that was in 1999. That project was just completed about 2 years ago. So, and I wasn't there when we originally thought of the idea. It's when we forgot the first dollar. It's a very long way of saying a lot of the mega capital projects they are looking to achieve by 2028 haven't even begun the environmental processes yet. So I think at some point, the big ticket, the LA was looking at using the Olympics to fund a lot of big ticket capital projects. I think at some point in the very near future, they will realize that $2 billion or $1.2 billion isn't coming their way, and they are not going to use the Olympics to make massive rebuilds of their transit system. And they will look towards easier to accomplish operational and small capital projects. But the dollars, our dollars are secured. What I am concerned about is the attention that they will get. I don't know if it's better or worse that we have this administration. I will just say that in the last transportation bill, the Senate bill, there were only 4 transportation earmarks for California. I think that has largely to do with the fact that there was $200 million earmarked for LA Olympics. I don't think they're going to get that much money in this political climate, and anything that comes to LA will be Trump directly pushing for it, which means that our senators won't have to sort of pick and choose between LA and the rest of the state. That is my opinion. Said a different way, I don't think Senator Schiff and Senator Padilla are going to be the ones to solely deliver that money. It will have to be that size of money, and this world game, the stage will come directly from the president. So I think certainly we're monitoring it, and there were certainly discussions had with the senators' offices after, there were only 4 transportation earmarks and 200 million for LA. And I think they also sort of understood they cannot ignore the rest of the state. I don't think they intended to, but that's just how it worked out in the last appropriation bill. So we will certainly stay on top of that. And we do have champions in both of our senators, but certainly understand that sometimes you don't always get what you want. So, not to build too many analogies, but the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and we will be strategically squeaky.
Thank you. Do you have are we going to go hear from someone else? Or
Yeah.
okay.
Let's transition over to our stateside update. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah.
So Chris has some slides I hope will.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Chris Lee with Politico Group, and sorry for not being there in person. I'm recovering from a surgery on Friday and look pretty rough. So you can look at my slides instead of my beat up face. So that'll be good. All right. So let's go to the first slide for just a brief overview of what we're going to discuss today. So wanted to do a bit of a 2025 look ahead on state policy. Really, the bulk of the presentation is going to be focused on the intersection of climate and transportation issues. Got a brief discussion of some of what's going on in housing and homelessness, and then want to update you on Brown Act legislation and the state budget. And finally, we'll take questions at the end, but do feel free to speak up and interrupt if something is pressing during the presentation. Next slide, please. So again, SB 375, land use and transportation, continues to be a hot topic around the Capitol. SACOG joined with 3 of its other large MPO partners to write to the Air Resources Board. I think that was late summer, asking questions about how we rethink implementation. And that's been the subject of a work group convening folks from the administration and the MPOs. On the legislative front, there have been a lot of attempts over the last several years to really reform the bill and try to make it much more focused on implementation and outcomes rather than planning, which I think is a goal the MPOs conceptually share. But the solutions have been really evasive because SB 375 is a really delicate balance between housing stakeholders, local government, local control, state climate goals, transportation infrastructure, and all the interest groups that are included in that debate. This is really important in the SACOG region because multiple SB1 grant programs require an SB 375 sustainable community strategy that will meet the greenhouse gas reduction target. And so one of the key questions that we're looking at and stakeholders are discussing in the legislature this coming session is whether the APS, which is really the alternative to a sustainable community strategy, when you don't have the resources available in your plan to meet those greenhouse gas reduction targets, whether those regions should continue to be eligible for those competitive grant programs. We saw a letter from a lot of the environmental advocates who've been very active on this front to the Transportation Commission, to the CTC, CARB, Caltrans, laying out really 7 or 8 planks, one of which was they don't want to see this additional flexibility. And so with transportation stakeholders on one side of the issue and some folks in the environmental community, it's going to be an interesting debate this year to see how we can advance and really focus on actually implementing these plans and bringing those co-benefits, economic, transportation, housing affordability that really underlies SACOG's work in the region. Next slide, please. CAPTI is the Governor's Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure. So this was a document in 2019 that adopted pursuant to the governor's climate executive order in 2019, with the goal of aligning the state's discretionary transportation spending, so the funds that are under its direct control, with the state's climate goals. There's a draft underway. Comments were due on those proposals back in December. We haven't seen the updated draft quite yet, but some of the key items that we're taking a look at and monitoring for SACOG include developing a strategy for pricing transportation infrastructure, so managed lanes on state highways, and what is the state's role in that. Vehicle miles traveled mitigation banking. The governor released an executive order on infill also over the summer, which proposed changes in the environmental review process and what the state's mitigations for projects would look like, including funding for housing-related infill infrastructure. So this is something where we've seen that come up as a potential mitigation measure in some large managed lanes projects, including one locally, but it hasn't been viewed as a feasible mitigation measure for a variety of reasons. So this is something the governor's office and the Land Use and Climate Innovation Office, previously known as OPR, is looking into. And then one of the most controversial recommendations included in the draft CAPTI update was changing the eligibility of the Trade Corridors program and the Solutions for Congested Corridors program to really focus those programs on either projects that reduce driving, so reduce VMT, or have fully mitigated all of their VMT impacts. So that has really significant implications for the ability to fund major projects on freeways. Next slide, please. Cap and trade reauthorization is something that is on the agenda this year. I think it's a really open question of whether this is the session when it happens, particularly with the results in the November election. But the current program sets a statewide limit for sources responsible for the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions in the state. That authorization expires in 2030. The closer we get to that 2030 date, the more the economics of the current program don't really work. You're having companies come in and buy credits for their pollution. And so as we get closer to that date, really, we think we'll see the auction revenues decrease as the market mechanism kind of breaks down. And so that's why we're having this conversation 5 years before that expiration date. To date, $28 billion has been generated from cap and trade auction proceeds, have gone to a variety of programs. I'd highlight those transit programs, which are doled out basically by formula, as well as the AHSC program, which is a program where SACOG jurisdictions have done relatively well, funding affordable housing and related transportation improvements. And so the governor talked about this in his governor's budget released in January, did not have a specific proposal. And in the legislature, both the Senate and Assembly have assembled working groups that include a cross-section of members with different sort of policy responsibilities, transportation, environmental quality, et cetera, who are taking a deeper look at extending the program. So right now, still very kind of unsure what this will look like, but starting to think about what are the opportunities, particularly for programs like Green Means Go, in the cap and trade reauthorization debate. Next slide. And then finally, just we'll spend a moment on this, but we do anticipate legislation this year to start to really highlight the declining revenue receipts in California due to the conversion of the fleet to cleaner electric vehicles. There's a forthcoming report by the California Transportation Commission that's supposed to look at state and local transportation needs across all modes, so road, highway, transit, everything, and then an industry-sponsored report looking at future funding options that we anticipate will come out this year as well. We do think there will be a bill to really start this conversation, focused most likely on making parity between the amount of tax contribute to the state's transportation infrastructure. So really looking at the fact that I see my internet connection is unstable. Looking at the fact that zero emissions vehicles are paying a lot less towards ongoing maintenance of our street and road system and other transportation infrastructure. Next slide, please. And again, transit continues to be a significant issue. We've seen on the Senate side, Senator Arreguín from Berkeley is circulating a $2 billion general fund request to help avert transit fiscal cliffs. This is something that I think is a long shot in the current budget environment, especially because, as noted on the slide, the state has this transit transformation task force that is taking a much broader look at how we fund transit in the state and what the goals we're trying to achieve with transit are. There's some existing flexibilities related to fare box recovery standards and other things that expire at the end of the 25-26 fiscal year. And so I think we're going to probably see a pause on significant transit policy changes until this process winds up. But again, the fiscal realities, particularly for those operators that were heavily reliant on sort of urban commute patterns, have continued and creating significant budget pressures up here in Sacramento. Next slide. Just talk a little bit about housing and homelessness. So I think we're going to continue to see a focus on implementation and accountability. You know, the governor announced changes to grant agreements that would essentially allow the administration to claw back already awarded homelessness-related grants when jurisdictions aren't complying with certain housing laws, housing element requirements, and other state streamlined planning and zoning laws. That is really going to come to a head in the Housing and Homelessness Assistance Program and other programs. We saw a lot of impact fee legislation last year. There's federal litigation that has been put back to the lower courts to answer some of the key policy questions. So haven't seen a decision there, but really expect to continued focus on local fees and what that does to housing affordability and production. We're anticipating that last year's housing bond will be reintroduced. This is an opportunity for programs like REAP, which funds Green Means Go and SACOG, to highlight the value that they provide in the community. addressing affordability and economic development. And I think it's an open question of whether different programs than what were included in Assemblymember Wicks's housing bond last session should be included in the bond this year. Because again, message throughout this presentation, really think that those special fund opportunities like bonds, like cap and trade, are where the opportunities for SACOG will be in the coming year. Next slide. Then finally, two open meetings bills have been reintroduced. The Just Cause Flexibilities Bill that failed last year is AB 259 Rubio, and then the Advisory Bodies Bill, which was AB 817 last year, is returning as SB 239 Arreguín. Mr. Arreguín was recently the mayor of Berkeley and a member of the Association of Bay Area Governments. He's on a lot of key committees for us, so someone who we can watch and hopefully support his efforts because he has such a good understanding of some of these local government issues. Unfortunately, however, for both of these bills, the key committee leadership from last year remain in their roles, so it's really unclear whether these bills are going to have a different chance for success, but it's good to see that they're moving forward once again. Next slide. And I put this at the end because really I consider the January budget dead letter at this point. The governor released it January 10th. The state was on fire soon after that date in Los Angeles. So huge uncertainty related to that. Federal funding, the Biden administration initially said the feds will cover 100% of those disaster response costs. The traditional is a 75% federal, 25% local. Obviously, the dynamics with the new administration are very different, and we're talking about, hundreds of billions of dollars of damage in Los Angeles County. So on the revenue side, federal assistance, and on the expenditure side, what does the state do to offset those costs, particularly for public infrastructure? Huge uncertainty what those numbers will be. So while the January budget is a nice thought exercise, it's really not something I'm spending a lot of time thinking about because I think we're going to see a really different budget here in May when the updated revenues are available. So also, we'll just note that for transportation and housing really is a status quo budget, no major changes in funding. To harken back to the LA Olympics discussion, agree with a lot of what Jason said. Any big capital projects are things that they've been pursuing funding for several years in advance. If you look back to the 2020 transportation infrastructure funding package, which is part of a negotiation about high-speed rail bonds, a lot of the transit and intercity rail capital formula program funding went to LA, and there was a lot of messaging about the need to support transit in LA, particularly as the 2028 Olympics approach. But again, don't anticipate a lot of changes there. It's really going to be what do we see on the relief front. One area where that came up immediately was a discussion about how we dispose of the $1.5 billion in fire-related resilience funding that's available in the Proposition 4 Climate Bond. A proposal to really allocate that to Southern California immediately caused a lot of controversy, and so the legislature has essentially punted on that until later in the budget process this year. But again, that kind of reiterates this focus of special funds are where a lot of the opportunities are going to be. That can cut both ways, clearly, but the opportunities that we see for SACOG are really focusing on that cap and trade discussion because Green Means Go is so closely related to key state goals and to really fulfilling climate goals in a way that promotes housing affordability, which is just a sweet spot for that conversation. And then to a lesser extent, a potential housing bond. So that's the end of the presentation. Again, sorry for the strange format. Wish I was there in person, but happy to answer any questions at this point.
Thank you very much, and hope you wish you a speedy recovery as you move forward with your surgery. Are there any questions or comments from the board at this time? All right. Well, thank you very much. Lots to think about this year, both at the state and federal level. So and a lot of work to do as well. So good. All right. Well, that was just an informational item. So again, thank you very much, Chris and Jason as well for your information. And thanks to staff too. I have served on a lot of boards and commissions over the past 25 years. And I have to say that our advocacy procedures are very thorough. If everyone's had a chance to review them, but there's a lot of detail in there. So it's pretty clear what we're looking for at the federal and state level as we move forward. So thank you very much. And we'll move forward to the next item on the agenda, which is a quarterly report on contracts. Heather.
Great. Yeah, as Heather comes up, again, just as part of starting off the year, I wanted to have you meet another part of our staff that supports this committee and get you an understanding of kind of the contracts that are coming before SACOG.
Morning, my name's Heather Luke. I'm procurement officer here. So we process quite a few contracts through SACOG. To give you a little bit of an overview, we have about 157 active contracts right now. We also have one contract analyst who's processing those. So in order to maintain transparency, we bring a report to the board quarterly with all of the new contracts that we've executed, as well as all the amendments. The report goes to the board in February, May, August, and November each year. The report includes all of the subrecipient agreements and MOUs that we have with other jurisdictions or transit agencies, consultant agreements for services related to all of our different projects, as well as software service agreements, and then a smaller number of small purchases. So that's just kind of a really brief overview, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those for you.
Thank you. I just had a quick question. I noticed that there is a reduction in a lot of the Green Means Go, and that's just because of the reduction in the transportation.
Right, that was the
Allocation, correct?
6%
Yeah,
cut that we
okay.
worked with all the jurisdictions.
So just wanted to confirm that. Good. Questions or comments from my colleagues? I didn't ask about public comment last time. It was just an informational item, but I will ask if there's any public comment on this item.
There's no public comment.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for putting this together. I appreciate it. And we'll move on to transportation funding overview.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'm gonna have our Director of Transportation, Christina Svensk, join me up here, and we're gonna walk through, as James highlighted earlier, a little bit on kind of all of the transportation funding available to our region and what SACOG's role is. So Christina's gonna kick it off, and then I'll take up the middle part of this.
Thanks, Eric. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here today. So yeah, as Eric mentioned, we're going to talk about transportation in our region in terms of funding. So a little bit about what's included, where does the money come from, and a little more information on our formula and competitive grants. I think it's really first important for us to kind of highlight what the board's role is in transportation funding. So, you know, you'll see and hear a lot in the coming months about our competitive regional funding program. There's a significant role, obviously, for the board in that in terms of how we craft our programs and how we award our projects, funding in the region, and everything that goes along with that. There's also just generally a lot of guidance and feedback and oversight that the board offers us, whether it's competitive or formula funding as well to our region. There's a lot we do with it, and we want to make sure that we're really using it in a way that makes sense for our region. So board's direction and feedback is very important and will be over the course of this year as we start to navigate both our state and federal programs, as well as some other funding through FTA. And the state with what we call the SB 125 dollars, which we'll mention a little bit later too. So what is included? Passenger vehicles, freight, transit, active transportation, things like technology. You might have heard of ITS. Those are all things that go in here, as well as maintenance and rehabilitation. As mentioned earlier in the item, we talked about maintenance is a big thing that we have in our blueprint, which you are all familiar with. So we get about $1 to $2 billion annually in our SACOG region that's programmed for these types of projects. We have our regional funding program. We also have just the transportation improvement program, which is both regional and state level, and then local investments as well, using local dollars. So lots of different things go into that $1 to $2 billion, which is a significant investment for a region for all of these different types of modes that we have.
So I'm going to pick this up at this point to talk a little bit about the kind of the three levels of funding. So as you heard from Christina, right, $1.2 billion sounds like a lot of money, but we know that there's a lot of need. And so we're going to talk less about that today, but at least talk about kind of the available funding for transportation. Where does it come from? Who controls it? And what role does SACOG have in that? So at a high level here, just want to highlight, we talked a lot about the federal government at the beginning of the meeting here today. Only about 12% of our funding comes through the federal government for transportation projects in the region. There is some federal funding that SACOG as a board gets to decide on, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. That makes up part of the regional share there. There are also state dollars that the board is given discretion by the state to control. That's also in the 5%. So of all the money in transportation, this board really only has discretion over about 5% of that. It's really important, right? But it is a small portion of that share. The largest source actually is local transportation, and this is sales tax measures in Sacramento County, but it's also the impact fees for development and other contributions from your general funds that might go into transportation purposes. So I'm going to walk through this in different chunks. Tried to color code things. So first at the high level, we have the federal funding. And before I kind of zoom into the California view here, stepping back, what you heard from Jason earlier, right, is there's this multi-year transportation bill, and about $113 billion a year is spent nationally on transportation. As Jason also mentioned, a lot of that goes out on formula. It's about 87% of the money goes to formula. And so when you go back to DC and you're advocating, what you're really advocating for is that 13% of the money for transportation funds. Like, what do you want the administration to award funding for? The other 87% is actually coming on a formula to Caltrans. And then from there, as you heard, there's a state formula that says, we don't want all the decisions made at Caltrans for local transportation investments. We think that the local governments through the Metropolitan Planning Organization should be making those decisions. And so on the far right here, you'll see the CMAQ and the Surface Transportation Block Grant, about $55 million a year is funding that flows through on those formulas to this board. And that's what we typically call our regional funding rounds. On the transit side of things, it's a similar kind of flow down in terms of formulas, but at the federal level, it's more of a 50-50 split. So about half the decisions on transit funds are made in DC on what's funded. That funds things both like the light rail expansion projects or the light rail vehicle car replacements that you've seen, but also bus replacements, right? Some of those are competitive grants on a national basis, and so that benefits all the transit providers across the region. And so as you can see, these darker blue, there's about $50 million in competitive FTA grants that come to the region, and about $50 million on average in highway side funds that our region has won over the last several years. So moving on to the next slide, focusing a bit more on kind of what does SACOG control. So I mentioned those first two kind of highway funds is what we call them. They come from the Federal Highway Administration, but they're really flexible, as you heard from Jason earlier. And so the board has set a new structure for how we're going to compete across 6 counties, because that was part of a corrective action that came down to California, that having things divided up county by county on a population basis was not permitted. And so there needed to be competition among each MPO, which SACOG is for the 6 counties. Now, when we get to the state side, right, we'll hear about El Dorado and Placer counties and how they have under state law funds that they control, but under the 6 county federal designation, the 55 million in competitive funds are across all 6 counties. I also have in the middle here carbon reduction. So that is a new program that was set up in that last authorization bill. And so when you're going back to advocate in DC, one of the big policy questions is how many formula programs should exist and where should those decisions be made? And one of the things that changed, while 13% isn't a lot, it was more closer to 1 to 5% of funding, right, that was actually decided in DC. Most of the funding decisions were always pushed back down to the states in the past. And so I think one of the questions that the authorizers will be reviewing is both carbon reduction, but many other programs. Should we put even more of the money down to the state level? And then should any of that go down to the MPO level? But that's a program that we've utilized over the last few years to fund some of our regional trails work, for example. So that's been a useful program that started up, but we'll see if that's reauthorized in the new authorization bill. And then those final two light blue boxes are the transit related formula funds that come to our region. There is a formula distribution that we give to transit agencies based on their performance. But there is also a small set aside for discretionary competition among transit agencies, and that also works across multiple counties. And then finally, as I mentioned before, there are competitive grants that we go back to DC. Well, SACOG, participates sometimes in those grant applications, but local agencies also go on their own. Caltrans also goes and puts in applications for federal funding. So moving over to the state side, it's a bit more complicated in terms of the revenue coming in. So I kind of glossed over it at the federal level, but there's the federal gas tax, which hasn't been raised since the early 90s. That plus general funds kind of feeds that 113 billion nationally that they have to work with. On the state side, gas taxes, the new gas taxes and electric vehicle fees from SB1, sales taxes, all those things come together, truck weight fees to pay for transportation related services. And unlike at the federal level where things are kind of divided between highways and transit, and then you kind of move on from there, the state level, we have to fund things like the CHP. We also have to fund the operations of Caltrans, snow removal, culverts, like all those things that are taken care of. And we also at the state level have funding going down to the local level directly, whereas the state level, right, things at the federal level, things kind of either go to the state or an MPO. And so what does that look like for our region? So there's kind of three levels where I'll break things down here. First, at the state agency level, what we have here is calling out that the money that actually goes directly to Caltrans, but is utilized in our region. And so we talk about the STIP funding, that's the State Transportation Improvement Program. That's the 4-county funding that we have on a competitive basis. And that's actually going to go to the full board for a discussion this month. And Christina will talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But there's also a set aside of that funding source that goes directly to Caltrans. That's called the interregional TIP. And in our region, it's between $10 and $30 million a year on improving the state highway system in our region that we benefit from. There's also the maintenance of the state highway system. So between $200 and $500 million is used to just maintain the existing highway infrastructure. And again, those are direct Caltrans expenditures that don't come to us, but certainly benefit the system that we're all trying to maintain and improve. So that middle band there, the regional transportation planning agencies, that's what SACOG is for Sacramento, Yolo, Yuba, and Sutter counties. And there's transit formula funds that I talked about at the beginning of the meeting, the state funds, and then there are these one-time transit funds called SB 125 that Christina can talk a little bit more about, where we have several years to assist transit agencies really in kind of recovering due to the impacts of the pandemic era reductions in transit use. And then the final slice of this are cities and counties. So as I mentioned, there are direct funds from gas taxes that go to cities and counties. And then cities and counties also compete and do pretty well on discretionary state level grants. So what that looks like, turned to kind of another way, right, is we have these funds for transit that this committee will be recommending a few times a year that flow out on formula. We have these discretionary funds that the board needs to make policy decisions on. There's the formula funds that flow to cities and counties. And then our region on average has gotten between $100 and $150 million in competitive grants, largely through SB1 funded programs, for all manner of local projects, transit projects, capital corridor improvements, many different things that benefit our region. So the final slice I'm going to talk about before I hand it back over to Christina is on the local side. So I mentioned that Measure A generates a sizable amount of money for Sacramento County for transportation related projects, but there's also many cities who have passed sales tax measures where they're setting aside some or all of that funding for transportation purposes. And we don't have great detailed information that I can share with you on that, but I know that many of you in your direct city or county hats are more familiar with some of those investments. Our transit agencies in total across the 6-county region are generating about $20 to $25 million a year in fare box, or the fare paying users of their systems. And then, as I mentioned before, based on the economic conditions, it can be anywhere between $100 and $300 million a year in impact fees, assessments, general fund transfers for transportation that all go to transportation. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Christina to talk about our regional programs.
Thank you. So if you remember a few slides ago, you saw the pie chart, and Eric mentioned that 5%. So this is the bulk of what that 5% is. So we have our 6-county competitive program. Many of you that were here the last year or two, remember we went through a massive reorganization of what our funding round will look like, particularly on the federal side. This is now a 6-county competitive program, whereas before it was just 4 counties. So that is going to be kind of a bulk of your discussions this year as we move towards actually putting that into motion. We also have, as part of that, priority programs. Those priority programs are things that we just sort of are board kind of directed and budget adopted to fund. These are things like our sustainable mobility program, which was Mode Shift before. This is our 2 air quality related programs called CCAT and Spare the Air. We have 2 new ones coming through the federal funding program, the Freeway Surface Patrol, and one called Regional Pavement Program, which is aimed at kind of looking at maintenance needs in our region and pavement condition and getting everybody on the same playing field in terms of how we assess pavement condition and how we fund maintenance projects. So that goes hand in hand with a lot of what we heard in our working group process for the funding program. And lastly, it also includes our Engage, Empower, Implement, or EEI program, which we just had awards for late last year. I forget we're in 2025 already. So those are very key priority programs we're looking to continue to fund. We also have carbon reduction, which was mentioned a little earlier. We had our first awards last year on that, and that funded zero emission vehicle related projects, as well as implementation of our trails plan. We will be doing another round of that in a few years, probably one to 2 years maybe, related to trails, but also implementing our mobility zones project, which is another project you'll hear about over the course of the year. So really important source of money for some of our key initiatives here in the region. Those are federal sources. On the state side, we have our active transportation program. We'll be announcing awards from that in the coming weeks. That varies year to year, or program cycle to program cycle. This past one, we had about $4 million for our entire region due to state budget issues. Prior to that, it was significantly more. So it's really hard to say what's going to happen with that, but that is one that we do administer regional in addition to the state's active transportation program. And then we have our STIP, our State Transportation Improvement Program. This is also a new organization of how we put that funding back out to the 4 counties. Again, this is Yolo, Yuba, Sutter, and Sacramento only when it comes to state. We are doing something different this time. We just took an item last week to the Transportation Committee where we are guaranteeing the dollars that you see up there back to those counties for a competitive process within each of those counties. But they also made a decision to set aside 10%, and this will be going to the board, 10% to support a regionally significant project within those 4 counties. So perhaps something off of our grant prioritization list, or a large project in Yuba and or Sutter counties. So really sort of impactful with all of our regional programs together. Taking a closer look at how this funding has kind of shook out over the last 20 years almost, you can see the dark green on the bottom is Sacramento County, obviously representing the largest county in the 4-county region, and the remaining 3 counties are shown in the lighter green. You can kind of see that there is a 73 to 74% average of how much is going back to Sacramento County. Why we are showing this is there's a lot of discussion when it comes to transportation funding on a fair share. The state calculates those STIP shares that I mentioned earlier, the STIP money that's going back to the counties, by a formula of population and lane miles. It's 75% population, 25% lane miles. That is sort of how they interpret what a fair share would be. So looking at that, it's about 74% for Sacramento County. And historically, over the last 20 years, Sacramento County has received about 73% of the state funding that comes in through our programs. With the message here being, there's always going to be variations year to year, just because that's how it is, right? That is how life is. But over time, it ends up evening out to kind of be where it should be. And so this is a very important message as we go through our funding programs, to know that everything is cyclical, everything varies, but over time it ends up evening out as it should. Taking a kind of deeper look into the 4 counties themselves. Again, you see on the left that population and lane miles calculation, and on the right, you see what actually came out of our discretionary state program, very much in line with each other there in terms of percentages. So I think we're doing pretty well in the region to kind of getting the funding to where it needs to go within the 4 counties. And I will just make a little note here. Again, just a reminder, you don't see Placer and El Dorado here because they are their own RTPAs, and it's a very different process there with how the STIP funding is distributed with those counties. So we've talked a lot about those sort of flexible funds that could fund a lot of different projects. There is, as Eric mentioned, transit-specific funding as well. This is also part of that 5% that in the other pie chart, the FTA, that $5 million that you see, the 12%, that's a discretionary share that we have as a competitive transit program. The remaining 88% of it goes back to our transit agencies under formula. And we also have the SB 125 program. That is the one-time funding from the state to help with the fiscal cliff. It helps with both operating and capital projects in a region that are necessary to sustain ridership, make sure that transit isn't needing to make further cuts, that instead it's stabilizing the service and helping to get more ridership on the system so that they can be more sustainable. You'll be seeing an allocation plan coming forward very soon for our next round of SB 125 funding. And we anticipate probably 1 to 2 more as those funds cycle through the 5-year allocation period that was available. On the formula side, we also do have, besides the FTA funding, we have TDA, which is Transportation Development Act funding, STA, which is State Transit Assistance, and SGR, which is State of Good Repair. Those are all for transit operating or capital, depending on the source, and those go directly to our transit operators with us simply as a pass-through for those. So that was sort of the last of the slides with a lot of information on them, but just, a reminder to go back to where we started. You can see this is really complicated. There's a lot here. There's a lot that we do as an MPO and an RTPA. So your role is super, super important. We're stewards of public dollars. We want to make sure that those are going where it needs to go. That's a huge responsibility that we all collectively have between the board and the staff at SACOG. And so we just want to make sure that we're continuing to work together with you as we start to make decisions and continue to make decisions on funding, and look forward to your partnership through it all. I would also say, if you do have any questions, particularly maybe some of the newer board members, please do reach out. I'm happy to kind of walk through this more and provide you with any additional information that you might need on how this funding goes out. So ready to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you. And just a reminder to everyone that the presentations that we've just seen today I know that Lynette, our clerk, sent them out last night, so they are available in your email if you want to take a closer look. With that said, I'd like to open this up for any questions. Are there any questions or comments? Seeing none, thank you very much. And again, the presentations are available for all of us. We appreciate it. Madam Clerk, is there any public comment on this item?
There's no public comment.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. This is a next item on the agenda is just to receive and file. So no action is needed at that time. And seeing that there are no additional items for business on the agenda at this time, without objection, I will adjourn the meeting. Seeing no objection, that shall be the order. Thank you, everyone.